5,
4,
3,
2,
1,
go. Hello and welcome to Space Now, the space news podcast from the National Space Centre that goes beyond the headlines. I'm Dara Patel, a space expert here at the National Space Centre, and today in our studio we're joined for the first time with a guest for our podcast, Bleddyn Bowen. He's an expert in the fields of astropolitics and space warfare. Bleddyn, it's great to have you on the podcast. When we described you in the introduction, we said that you are an expert when it comes to astropolitics and space warfare, but reading your biography, you know, there's things like space policy, international relations, all sorts on there, and they're quite big words sometimes. So can you summarise, I guess, what it is that you do, what your research is, and where your area of expertise lies?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me on, Dara. It's great to be back at the Space Centre. So my area really is covering anything that we can call political as it applies to outer space, events in space, or space technology, because everything we build as people, it serves human interests and human activities. So they're ultimately about what people want to do, and that is politics.
Okay, and you cover lots of different parts as part of your role. I know when reading up on your sort of biography again, you've done things like advise governments, advise different space agencies. What is it that you're actually helping to advise them on?
So a lot of what I do is putting particular kinds of space policies or activities or programs in a larger historical or political context. So if a particular government agency is interested in developing this kind of technology, I would ask, have you thought about the geopolitical dimensions of this? Have you considered that the Chinese are working along similar lines and will be able to do something on a much bigger scale, maybe much faster, and perhaps with some security implications as well?
There's a few words that you threw around there that already make me feel a bit tense. So things like security and geopolitics. We're talking about space. So how does that relate to geopolitics? And we're talking about Earth politics.
So most of my work actually involves the satellites that are in orbit around our planet and the rockets that put the satellites in space, and then all of the ground stations, the terminals, the satellite dishes, and the global communication systems that use those satellites. And the data and the services that satellites provide are useful not only for our day-to-day lives in the economy with precision pizza deliveries, for example.
Our Uber and our Just Eat.
Yeah, so we're quite familiar with that, the civilian uses of space systems, but they are also extremely useful for military and intelligence purposes as well, for national security. So governments use satellites to control military forces to make sure that they can communicate with forces wherever they are. It also is used for spy satellites, so that military forces can track and monitor what other countries' armed forces are doing, or say terrorist or militia groups as well.
Now, when you're talking about sort of like military and the spying capabilities, we might think that that's perhaps a modern application, but that's almost where space and space applications began. So if we take ourselves back to the height of the Cold War, many people are familiar with, you know, these two great superpowers, the USA and the USSR, or formerly the Soviet Union. And they were going at sort of loggerheads, trying to one-up each other in terms of, you know, first into orbit, first person in orbit. And eventually that culminated with the Apollo program, and the first crewed landing was on the moon by the USA. And so we think about space being a loggerhead of these two space superpowers, but what does it mean to be a superpower? And what does that look like today? Because I don't think space is the same as it was, you know, 50 odd years ago.
So in the 1950s, the 1960s, the superpowers used the space race, so the race to put the first satellite in space or to put the first people in space or then on the moon. They used it as a way to demonstrate their technological capabilities. These were brand new technologies that were the most expensive, the most temperamental and most unproven. So if you could do those things, it showed how much technical skill and resources you could muster. And of course, they had the ideological benefits then for the communist Soviet Union and then the capitalist democratic United States. But these also, beneath them, demonstrated a very real military capability, and that was to use heavy rockets to launch nuclear weapons into space and to destroy other countries. So that was a fundamental military benefit of the space race for the superpowers. Okay. Fast forward to today, the same capabilities have spread to also many other countries that also have big space programs. So thinking specifically of France and Europe more broadly, but also China and India as well. Also North Korea and to a lesser extent Iran. So those things do still persist, but a lot of the way we look at superpowers in space now, especially China and America, is of the thousands of satellites that they have in space providing those really important civilian and also national security infrastructure.
Okay, so I guess what you're saying is in the past it was very much the military prowess that kind of described these as superpowers, but what we're looking at today is perhaps a wider range of nations, or at least space organizations that have those military capabilities, but also now it's the ability to put infrastructure in space, so that's your satellites or technology, that allow you to have other applications, so things like the technology, the communication, the security, but all the civil day-to-day applications too.
Yes, pretty much. And that's what I mean by the title of my book, Original Sin, where everything came first with a military angle for a lot of the big countries in space. But since then, satellite applications have become what we call critical infrastructure for many countries, and now also our global economy and global systems. And an example of this can be navigation satellites. So we've all heard about GPS, for example. Mm-hmm. That's the US navigation satellites. That tells you where you go and how not to get lost in country lanes, etc. But Europe has also built its own system now, the Galileo system. China has its own called Beidou as well, and also Russia has one called GLONASS, and a couple of other countries have smaller versions as well. But these show that these countries can do the most sophisticated and important navigation infrastructure that modern economies need, and not many countries can build these, but if you can, you become a really important part of the world's economic infrastructure.
So you basically have sovereign capability. It's your own capability of being able to do things like provide navigation. So thinking about these superpowers, and I'm thinking about just generally here on the Earth, we might think of football teams or whatever it is, and you've got the top dogs, as to speak, all riling up. But actually, to make sure that it remains a fair domain for everyone, we have to think about sort of space policy in general, right? And you talked about this as being one of your areas of expertise. So how do you see the treaties and the law and the governments of today? Is it adequate? Will it prevent these superpowers from sort of just running off and leaving everyone else in the dust? Or is there something in place to make sure that everyone may have equitable access in the long run?
So despite what some billionaires might think, the United Nations systems of laws and governance do extend into outer space. It's not a complete free-for-all up there. There are rules that most states or countries in the United Nations have signed up to and have agreed to, and the most important of which is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty.
Sure.
Now, this doesn't mean that everything is fair, because the United Nations system as a whole has many problems, but it is the only way we have to try and represent smaller countries or countries that are only just starting with their own space programs. But the big countries will have more influence in getting new rules agreed. But the United Kingdom has been very busy in the last few years trying to get common understanding on what the main problems are in space, and therefore what can we agree on together as common solutions to them. And we're still talking that through the United Nations now. It's a very slow process, but maybe one day we'll get there.
That's a really interesting point that you say, that the UK are involved in sort of the regulation and kind of pushing for the policy to be made, I guess, better than the general principles that the Outer Space Treaty is. And I guess that's a nice point for us to move on to our second section, which is to talk about whether the UK is a superpower in itself and what the strengths or the challenges of our nation are. Okay, Bleddyn, so we're talking about the UK, and I guess first and foremost, would we consider the UK to be a superpower? In my eyes, what you've described as being a superpower, we don't have all those capabilities on our own.
No, we don't. We're quite a modest power when it comes to space. So we don't do nothing, but we can't do what the biggest powers do, and not by ourselves.
Okay.
So the UK has traditionally been dependent on the United States on the military and intelligence side of space. So we get a lot of spy satellite data from the Americans. Okay. We also share a lot of technology with the Americans as well, especially for the military. but we have become very much an important part of the European space industry and also the space science community. So Britain's been a founding member of the European Space Agency, and we are still members of ESA. So we are still a very large power within the European system.
Okay.
Of course, we're no longer members of the European Union after Brexit a few years ago now, but we are still part of the larger European industry when it comes to space. So, and given the way things might be going now with the Labour government, we seem to be getting closer in terms of economic cooperation with the European Union. So we might be able to get back into some European Union space programs for our businesses and industry again.
Okay, so we're maybe missing out on some of those things by being kind of separate from Europe, but we are still part of, like you say, the European Space Agency, and we are, I guess, one of the larger kind of contributors to the Space Agency.
Yes, so at the moment, the UK is the 5th largest contributor to ESA's budget. First is the European Union, they're the biggest one.
Okay.
Then France, then Germany, then Italy, and then it's Britain.
Right, okay.
Many people are surprised to hear that Italy spends more on the European Space Agency than Britain, and that has almost always been the case, and Italy has tended to invest more in its space industry than the British have.
They've definitely got more manufacturing, right? So there's like Thales Alenia, and I guess there's some companies, and they're very much involved in a lot of the manufacturing side.
And they've had a more focused national science programme for space as well, which
Right.
they've done through the European Space Agency as well.
Okay, so the UK on its own isn't necessarily a superpower, a modest one at best, as you put it, but as part of the European Space Agency, perhaps it has a bigger reach working with companions.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that the UK can do that it's actually a world leader in. So, for example, right here in Leicester, X-ray astronomy, for example, and X-ray instrumentation. So in that area of science, if you want to do anything with X-rays, the UK is...
You're coming to the UK.
You're coming to the UK.
Okay.
Also, in my university in Durham, the other forms of astronomy and cosmology is another world-leading centre there, for example. So in specific aspects of space manufacturing or space science and industry, the UK has niche strengths, like most European countries. And ESA has been successful because it's able to knit together all of Europe's specialisms to have a broad capability that it can then do big missions as a collective Europe. Things that one of those countries, they couldn't do everything by themselves.
I'm thinking of this like a big space buffet. Like everyone brings something to the party, and then you've got like a whole collection of food that everyone can enjoy, that you can put, things together that you otherwise wouldn't be able to on your own.
A smorgasbord, as I believe
Yes.
the Norwegians might call
Okay.
it. Yes.
I'm getting hungry. So we talked about the strengths of the UK, and I think the two things that stand out from this are the space science capabilities. So that's the research, but perhaps the instrumentation. So like building the X-ray instruments that might go on spacecraft or satellites into space. But secondly, some of the manufacturing, and in particular, the small satellite manufacturing. So that's the strengths of the UK. But what are our challenges? How do we perhaps become a bigger or more modest superpower? And is that important? Should we be thinking about becoming a larger player in space?
It depends really on what people want the priorities to be. There are many different ways you can go down to do more in space. So it could even just be expanding what we do well already. So the small satellites you mentioned already. So even that is not done at a big scale. It's not done at the scale of the Starlink satellites, where hundreds are just rolling off the production line. Or OneWeb, for example. I know that the French now basically have OneWeb, and they're building another 100 now in France. So there's a scale of what we already do that you can look at, or there are other areas that you might want to get into in terms of other advanced instrumentation. You can look at, the UK government says it wants to have launch, but it's not creating the demand for that by having a national satellite program for the launches then.
Right.
So there are trade-offs because we can't do everything. So there are areas where you can start looking at in terms of manufacturing, but also the skills and the people. So a lot of the operations for satellites, so flying the satellites, control of them, is actually done by commercial companies, and a lot of them are sort of European-wide companies. For example, the Ministry of Defence's communication satellites, Skynet, which predate the Terminator films, I hasten to add, they are operated by civilian contractors. They're not operated by people in uniform, but it's done for the military.
But they are communicating with satellites in space?
Yes, for the military.
Right.
So there's not a lot of expertise in the government on that. They have to outsource it. That used to not be the case. So you can still look at where the skills are, because there's a lot of skills now that the government or the state doesn't have, that now is owned or controlled by very large companies. So you can look at people and skills as well as manufacturing in terms of areas we might want to do more in.
Okay, so scalability is one thing, and that's in terms of ramping up perhaps our manufacturing or whatever it is, but also then the investment in the skills and the people, I guess, in working in the industry.
And an area where that can, perhaps be a challenge is the new radar they want to build in Pembrokeshire, the deep space advanced radar capability. This would be a radar operated by the Ministry of Defence to look at satellites in the geostationary orbital belt, so 36,000 kilometres above the equator. And the Americans are building the radar, the technology itself. The British will build the base, but it will be operated by British military personnel, and those people have to come from somewhere, and they need quite a lot of people. So that's a clear area where we can do more, but we need the people, not just the fancy kit to do it.
Okay. And this radar, like you said, is to look at satellites in geostationary orbit. This is where a satellite is orbiting at the same rate that the Earth spins, so it's basically looking down at the same point on the Earth. Why is that important? Why should we invest in that?
So some of our most important satellites are in the geostationary belt, including the Skynet satellites, which I mentioned, but including most of your satellite TV satellites are up there as well. So if you see all those dishes in everyone's houses, they're all pointing at the same point in the sky. They're usually looking southwards towards the equator. That's because they're all looking at the same satellite to get your satellite TV and the 500 channels. And everyone's
going home now and looking at all the satellites on the roofs.
Yes, and really important satellites are there, and it's only getting busier there. And some countries are conducting quite risky manoeuvres there now as well. So it's even more important that we have more information and understanding of what's going on up there.
Okay. I guess last question in this section. If you were in charge of driving forward what the UK should be doing, what would your suggestion be? Like, we're here now, we're a modest-ish superpower, we're working within the European Space Agency, we have international collaboration, we have our strengths, but we also have the challenges or issues. If you were going to drive it forward, what should we be doing?
I would try to maximise the influence we have in the European Space Agency. So that would be our main forum for working with our European friends, but also to get more returns for our industry. So we have to be better at the European Space Agency and do more there. So would also mean funding it more. But also in terms of the UK national picture, I would suggest perhaps focusing on a smaller number of areas and doing more there. At the moment, and I said this to the House of Lords Committee on UK engagement to space a couple of months ago, who are looking at this, and I said my feeling right now is the UK is spending too little money in too many places. So, butter scraped over too much bread.
Yeah, okay.
So I would like to see perhaps more focus, more prioritization, and then spending more money and consolidating the people to work on things and get more done in specific areas.
Nice. So thinking about the future, I think one of the things that seems to come up in space a lot more is the idea of defense and security. Every nation wants to ensure that they have the infrastructure to keep their own nation safe, both from a sort of the cyber kind of challenges that we face, but also the more kind of space war armament military kind of proposed things that may happen. So I guess the question is, are we safe? Do we have enough in the UK kind of security? but also worldwide, thinking about what's the likelihood that this arms race is going to be taken to space?
So those are all really difficult questions, but they are questions that people in my field, international relations and security studies, deal with all the time. Sadly, we don't always come up with fantastic answers or solutions to everything, but we are thinking through these problems. And in terms of space security or space warfare, what we've seen in the last 30, 40 years is only the increasing importance of satellites for military capabilities.
Okay.
So for any listeners old enough to remember the 1991 Gulf War, that is called the first space war because satellites were so useful for the campaign to liberate Kuwait and push back the Iraqi army back into Iraq, and making sure that the tanks didn't get lost in the desert for a surprise attack.
So these satellites have the capability of looking back on Earth, helping us monitor what's going on the ground, perhaps intercept signals or listen to communication. It's all these different things that can help us in the war.
So the Americans refer to applied witchcraft when they mean the spying from space. So it could be looking at things happening on Earth, so imagery intelligence, or listening from space, the signals intelligence as well. So these are really important capabilities, and they're only getting more useful. So in terms of war planning and military weapons developments, different countries are looking at methods of disrupting the use of those satellites or challenging their security if the need ever arises or that the political orders are given to do so. And there's a range of methods these can be done. So it could be a missile that shoots up into space and physically blows it up or rams into a satellite, creating loads of debris in the process.
Okay, so that sounds very dangerous.
It is. It's not ideal if it happens, and different countries have created those through tests in the past. China in 2007, the United States a year later in 2008, and then India in 2019, and Russia again in 2021.
So we've seen these countries blow up their own satellites, not anyone else's, but they're showing their capability that if we wanted to, we have the ability.
Proving the capability to do it and putting it on notice, really.
Okay.
But there are other methods. So China has reportedly been dazzling the lenses of spy satellites with lasers on the ground.
And that stops it from being able to do its job or communicate.
It can see. And depending how strong the laser is, it could damage it, or it's just a temporary thing as when it flies over wherever the laser is. Other methods you mentioned already, cyber. So we need computers to operate satellites. So if you can get a virus or malware into the computer control systems, you can take it out of action, or you could perhaps even hijack it.
Oh, gosh.
Then there's electronic warfare as well, radio jamming. So as well as the computers, we need radios to be able to communicate wirelessly with the satellites, so you can disrupt those radio links as well then. So, and we've seen a lot of that happen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Russia's been jamming a lot of satellites over Ukraine.
So a lot of this seems very kind of satellite based in terms of we're looking at the satellites of other countries and seeing what we could do to potentially stop them from being used for, you know, war or some sort of armament. Relatively, that seems like it's not a very violent thing to do. Is something more violent on the horizon, or is it going down the route of kind of the technological warfare side of things?
So it can be very physically destructive.
Okay.
And there can be, depending on what happens and how much of it, it can be very destructive and have consequences for us on the ground. So if in the geostationary belt, a handful of crucial satellites are knocked out with an explosive device or a ramming system, and it creates a large cloud of debris that then starts knocking everything else out in the geostationary belt, that will cause a lot of communications problems around the world. Now, it won't switch everything off, but it'll start affecting a lot of secure government communications, which will put a lot of governments on edge.
Sure.
And that is not a good thing when nuclear weapons are involved. But many weather satellites are there as well, and everyone relies on weather satellites, including, you know, huge agricultural companies or even just farmers all across Southeast Asia who really need accurate weather systems or storm weather warnings, etc. So there are real possible humanitarian knock-on effects if enough damage happens in space.
Okay, so we don't want to wipe out a satellite because the debris from that travelling incredibly quickly will probably go on to damage other satellites and knock out bits of infrastructure that we rely on here on our planet.
And which is why a lot of countries and militaries are actually looking more at what we call the non-destructive or the soft methods.
The preventative, perhaps.
Well, not preventative, but reversible maybe, or non-physically destructive. So laser blinding or electronic warfare or perhaps cyber. So they don't blow things up, but they take them out of action.
And temporary in some cases, right?
Yeah, reversible or temporary.
Okay. Yeah. I guess to sort of wrap up this, should we be worried? And what do you think we need in our space policy to prevent something like this happening? Is policy enough? When we look at the Outer Space Treaty, they're general principles, but I think they've been bent a little bit over time. What do we need to see in space policy to make sure that this doesn't become, too far a reality? And should we be worried?
So this is not something I would encourage people to be specifically worried or alarmed about.
So let's not lose sleep over this.
Don't lose sleep over this if you weren't already losing sleep over the state of the world, I would say. Because, again, another argument I make in Original Sin is that whatever happens in space is an extension of politics on Earth. So space is not a political vacuum. So anything that'll happen in space, it'll happen alongside
whatever's
bad
happening
things
on
that
Earth.
are happening on Earth. And they will be much worse than things that might happen in space. So in that context, it's not something you should specifically get more alarmed about. There are many things we should be worried about on the planet. This is just, one of those other things to add to the list of things that are not good.
Okay.
Not worth losing any extra sleep over. But definitely things we need people to be interested in and to be reading and thinking about and talking to their elected representatives about, ideally as well.
So we should be wary of what's happening.
Yeah, and more people that understand these things are better, because some journalists write about these things and make it alarming to get you to click.
Sensationalising it.
Clickbait, sensationalising. Yeah. So we need more people to understand these things so that it's not to sugarcoat it or not to downplay the seriousness, but it's to have a more calm and collected understanding of what is or isn't happening and how bad or not something is. There's been a lot of misleading news reporting with various things in my time in this, in my career. But in terms of where do we go from here, what comes next, ideally we'd be able to start getting rules of the road agreed in space so that even if countries don't mean harm to others and their satellites, there are ways that they can demonstrate that, or ways they can behave so that their actions aren't misinterpreted. So there's no traffic rules in space. So like in the air, if you have two aircraft on a collision course, there are universal rules that everybody's agreed to, that they fly to the right to avoid each other.
Right, okay.
So that's a simple, if all the other things fail and two aircraft's going to crash, they fly
everybody
the same
knows
way.
how to use the air.
Yeah, everyone knows how to use it. In space, if two satellites are on a collision course, nobody has anything to tell them what to do.
So we're working it out on the spot.
Fly. So really what happens now is that you have usually the US military that has the best tracking systems in the world. They will pass on information to operators of different countries or different militaries in different countries saying, hey, we've got a collision warning here. You might want to check it out and tell the operator they might need to move their satellite. But there's no rules in terms of, well, who needs to move their satellite first? Who's got right of way here? So even basic stuff like that, which means that there's not a lot you can do if a powerful country really wants to do something bad.
Sure.
But in terms of everyday stuff to prevent accidents or misinterpretation of actions, we really need to have more common understanding. So ideally, that's where the United Nations will get at some point, and where the UK has actually been doing a lot of good to move forward conversation on that.
Interesting.
And hopefully, whenever Russia, China and America are on better speaking terms, at least then there'll be all the discussions we've had over many, many years ready to be picked up
on the table,
and things ready to agree on, because we're having these conversations now, whilst, at the moment, any agreement sounds like a distant prospect, but we have to be ready to move when the geopolitical headwinds turn for the better, which eventually they will, as they did in the darkest depths of the Cold War.
We'll remain optimistic.
Yes, we'll try.
Thank you so much, Bleddyn, for coming along and talking to us all about sort of space warfare policy and astropolitics. It's incredibly interesting, and like you say, I think the more people that are aware of this, the better we'll be in a position, I guess, when the tables are ready to turn. But yeah, thank you so much for coming along, and I know that our interested listeners will have plenty of questions. Now, if anyone wants to learn a little bit more about UK space politics, international, what's happening in space, what do you have? Where can people find out more about what you're doing or your research?
So I would recommend that your listeners buy Original Sin, Power, Technology and War in Outer Space. And that is a book published by Hearst Publishers here in the UK. And that is basically a international political history of the space age, and it looks at it from a global perspective as well. So it's not just the Soviets did this, the Americans did that, but it also is about Europe, Japan, India and China as well, and what it means for all of us living in the space age today.
Really nice. Yeah, so yeah, if you want to check out Bleddyn's book, then definitely have a look at that. And if anyone is local to Leicester or hoping to visit us in this year, then coming up in September on the 14th, we have our UK in Space Festival. So come along to hear from organisations, people and companies working here in our country on all aspects of space, research, engineering. Meet them and ask them your questions. That's coming up in September. Thank you all for listening to Space Now. Do remember to make sure that you subscribe in the podcast app or feed that you're listening in, and make sure that you never miss an episode. Other than that, we look forward to seeing you next week.